Long-time Livingston Parish inhabitant. His wife Denise is just been diagnosed with liver cancer. And she's been in a wheelchair for, oh my gosh, 25 years or so, just multiple sclerosis kind of things and whatnot. And they told her if she does chemo, she's got 2 years. If she doesn't do chemo, she's got 3 months. So, speaking to David the other day about that, so we'll see if I can drop him a line. He was asking about trying to come to church, so I'll see if we can get in touch with him there. But man, those are the kind of things that just, that's when it gets real, doesn't it? So today we're gonna diverge a little bit. If you're looking at your program, it is a audible. We called an audible. The reason that we called an audible is sometime this week I was told by someone that my political choices rendered me, I believe the words were immoral and unethical.
On Facebook?
Now the funny part is that this is someone that used to be a student of a school that I worked at. And before telling me that I was unethical and immoral, he said that he respected me a lot. And I'm like, well, that's, thank goodness, because I'd hate to know what an insult would look like, right? But it's interesting because we have reached a point, I think, if you've been around for a while, America hasn't been in this kind of upheaval since the Vietnam War. That was probably the big demarcation, if you will. At that point, people couldn't, well, people did. People made up their minds one way or another, and there wasn't a lot of dialogue going on. It was just a lot of venom, right? And so we're going to stay in chapter 22, but what we're going to do is kind of look at where Jesus said, well, just look, render to Caesar what's Caesar's and give God what's God. And a lot of people have said, well, that makes Jesus in the Bible kind of apolitical. Like he didn't really have any thinking about politics. And they'll point to things like Romans 13, and where Romans 13 it says, let everyone be subject to the governing authorities, for there's no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. Now, some people will read that and go, well, then that must mean that all the people that are in these places have been placed there by God, and I think that's a little bit too deterministic. If you read that, what it's really saying is governments have been instituted by God, and governments are there for a really good reason, because without government, we have chaos. But the same guy that wrote Romans 13, that wrote that, this is what he said in Acts 23. This is Paul. So the first one is Romans 13:1, and then this is Acts 23. And Paul looks straight at the Sanhedrin and says, my brothers, I have fulfilled my duty to God in all good conscience to this day. At this, the high priest Ananias ordered those standing near Paul to strike him on the mouth. Paul said to him, God will strike you, you whitewashed wall. You sit there to judge me according to the law, yet you yourself violate the law by commanding that I be struck. So there's a couple of things here. First of all, it's pretty clear that what Paul is doing here is not being subject to the governing authority. Paul is basically coming back to the governing authority, in this case, the Sanhedrin, and saying, you guys have it all wrong. So the expectation and responsibility of believers being able to speak into circumstances based upon biblical principles is well established. Those who were standing near Paul said, how dare you insult God's high priest? And Paul replied, well, I did not realize he was the high priest, for it is written, do not speak evil about the ruler of your people. Paul is pointing out, I know the law better than you do. Because he had already told him, he said, you yourself violating the law by commanding that I be struck. So he's like, do you want to go there? Do you really want to go there? Because if you do, we can play that game. I can go tit for tat. So there is this notion of governments are there, they're instituted by God, they're there for a reason, they stop chaos, they stop anarchy. But there are places and times where things that are going on need to be questioned. So we don't just blindly follow government We need government. Governments are there, like I said, instituted by God. But remember this, Jesus stood up to Pilate and told him what truth was. Moses stood up to Pharaoh and told him what plagues were. Nathan stood up to David. If you want to go read that one, that's a really good one, 2 Samuel, and it'll talk to you about how what David was doing was absolutely against what his authority was supposed to allow him to do. And then John stood up to Herod. So there's these times and places where what we do and say as believers is going to have some political overtones. Now we know Jesus was about mercy first, and justice was something there. He rebuked the theological leaders of his day, and he did it without pity. He was merciless in his rebukes of them. He exposed them as frauds and hypocrites. Now, as I said the other day, I was told that I was an intellectual and moral failure because I have a preference in the presidential election. I'm not here to give you a tutorial on who to vote for. That's not the point. But that's a profound statement to say that you're an intellectual and a moral failure. That pretty much makes you a doofus, right? I think that's a technical term. And it's a profound statement because not only is it profound about what it says, but it's profound about what is omitted. And so this is when I decided to call an audible, because we need to address, I think, how we respond as Christians to current political landscapes. So I'm going to use this as the first example. Recently, a candidate for vice president announced that abortion is, and I quote, a fundamental human right. Now, as a Christian, how do you take that, right? So that thinking, by the way, is now shared by the plurality of Americans. You will find yourself in the minority if you go out and advance a statement that seems to push up against that. And as we develop this conversation, I'll make it clear, I don't think what we're trying to do is stand out on the corner and point out where everyone else is wrong. What I want to do is talk about what do we do as Christians in a political environment. But we've also been told repeatedly in other contexts to follow the science. Follow the science. Follow the science. Well, in particular, what that was applied to was a little problem called COVID-19 that killed 7 million people across the world. On one side of the spectrum, you have some people who say it was only the flu. Well, it's not the flu. It's 10,000 times more contagious than the flu. It has genetic capabilities to attach itself, particularly the early forms of it. Now, thank goodness, it has managed to devolve itself into much more of a normal virus that doesn't have the lethality that the early versions did. But the early versions, the reasons why, that can be debated. But if you looked at the genetic sequence of the COVID, what it had genetic markers in it that have only been found in laboratory experiments. And what they do is they place these genetic markers that tell them the rest of this stuff we just inserted in here. And if you look at if you're of a mind to do this, I would recommend a book by Rand Paul, and I'm going to forget the name of it, but it is a marvelous, marvelous read about the development of the COVID-19 and so forth and so on. Well, here's the rest of the story. Follow the science, and this is where I was going with that. A whole bunch of emails got erased, deleted, and they were deleted by this person who has now been called to subpoenaed to appear before Congress and to explain why these emails got deleted. And this person said, I cannot speak to that on the grounds that it might incriminate me. And they have emails out there that says, well, they basically called her the Freedom of Information Act lady. She can tell you how to clean this stuff up to where it doesn't become Freedom of Information Act. So when we're told to follow the science, we need to understand sometimes it's not the science we're following, it's the people who interpret the science. And that's always the case. But on the one hand, we've got the people who said, well, it's nothing to it, it's just a bug. And anybody that's taken a vaccine they've got little nano things running around in their bloodstream now, and they're going to track you, and eventually in 9 months, everybody's going to be dead. On the other hand, we got these people over here saying, if you don't have the vaccine, you're going to wind up, everybody's going to die, including 2-year-old children. And of course, when we're looking at the mortality and morbidity rates for this thing, thank God, it targeted mostly people like me, the older, the ones who may have had some coexisting kind of problems. And the folks like Mark, if they get it, they tend to be a little bit more like, I just don't feel real good. Although there were the occasional circumstances where these people also had problems. But the problem is both of these things are wrong. Follow the science, right? So to follow the science, you need to know what the science says. And I just use that as an example. So if you ask the average person today, when does life begin? What will they tell you? The average person on the street, well, we don't really know. We don't know. It's just a clump of cells. You'll hear this sometimes. It's not viable. It's not viable. Some of these arguments are really kind of strange because to say it's not viable, well, if you put me in an aqualung and stick me 30 feet under the water, I'm in an environment that's viable. If you take me out of that environment, I don't have gills. I'm going to die. So to take something that is viable in this environment and to say it's not viable because you place it in another environment, well, then that's just kind of weird. Spacemen can't walk around outside their spaceship without their what? Spacesuit. That's their viable environment. So all of these arguments kind of get a little strange, but the reason they get strange, and remember, I'm going back to the first statement, abortion is a fundamental right. Human right. A fundamental human right. So early abortion, cluster of cells. Well, if you say it that way, that dehumanizes abortion. It brings it to an action that does it. It's really more about the choices that I need to make rather than the life that might have been developing. When there's a heartbeat, when there's respiration, brain activity, and so forth, now it starts to get a little bit trickier. But if abortion is a fundamental right, then why is it limited to any point in pregnancy? Because if you'll remember Roe v. Wade, one of the reasons why Roe v. Wade was passed was it was because the fetus is not guaranteed life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That right doesn't afford to the fetus, said Roe v. Wade. And so we don't have to worry about that. But if it's a right, then the question becomes, well, at what point in pregnancy does it cease to be a right? And we're seeing that happen right now, where we're arguing about whether children should be placed on the table because they've been born, and we'll go in the other room to discuss what we think should be done to the child. And this is the part I like, and we'll keep them comfortable. Why? Until we kill them. So I'm back to the question, when does life begin? Well, maybe we should follow the science, because that question has been asked and answered. In a 2021 peer-reviewed journal, a guy named Stephen Andrew Jacobs wrote a paper, and the paper is, you can find it on the NIH website if you have a mind to, The Scientific Consensus on When Human Life Begins. So I'm going to read directly from the abstract. Since a recent study suggested that 80% of Americans view biologists as the group most qualified to determine when a human life begins, experts in biology were surveyed to provide a new perspective to the literature on the experts' views on the matter. Biologists from 1,058 academic institutions around the world were given survey items on when a human life begins, and overall, 96% affirmed the fertilization view. The founding principles of the field's science communication suggest that scientists have an ethical and professional obligation to inform Americans, as well as people around the world, about scientific developments so members of the public can be empowered to make life decisions that are consistent with the best information available. Given that perspective, And a recent study's finding that a majority of Americans believe they deserve to know when a human's life begins in order to make informed reproductive decisions. Science communicators should work to increase the level of science awareness on the fertilization view, listen to this, as it stands alone as the leading biological perspective on when a human's life begins. So, what should have happened when someone says, I believe that abortion is a fundamental human right? What should have happened is, are you aware of the fertilization view that's held by the vast majority of biologists across the world, which says life begins when? At fertilization. So if it's a human right, then that means that this life must be what? Human. So now what you're saying is the human has a right to be, it's a human right to be aborted, even though you've had no say-so in it. You're now that far from euthanasia, where what we decide to do is we decide to take the elderly out because we're tired of dealing with them. They've really become a disruption to my life. This is the sticky wicket that the Christian finds themselves in today. So if life begins at fertilization and simultaneously abortion is a human right, then we're led to the point where the aborted life has a right to be aborted, yet the aborted life had no say-so in the activities. So from a science perspective, we have a real issue here. If you want to argue that life that begins at fertilization is not human, that would be strange because I've never seen a human give birth to a giraffe or a cow or any other animal other than a human. Humans create humans. So the life that begins at fertilization, according to 1,058 biologists, of which 96% said, that life is human and that life began at the moment of fertilization. Well, now, if that's the case, then abortion becomes a political matter of interest for a follower of Christ, and voters should be informed not only by scriptures that tell us that we're made in the image of God, that we're fearfully and wonderfully made, that we were knit together in our mother's womb by the hand of God, but we should also be informed by science. So, here's my first question. If I am morally and intellectually, if I'm immoral and intellectually wrong, is it moral to knowingly vote for a position that is antithetical to God's teaching, and in this case, scientific consensus? Is it okay to take the life of a developing child because of a personal preference? And the majority of America today would say, yes. And I'm not going to sit here and tell you that we're going to go out there and change the majority of what people are saying. What I'm about to talk to you about is our responsibility of how we have to answer our own conscience when it comes to dealing with these matters. So today, it's important to recognize, I don't care which party you pick, neither one of them is going to espouse a totally biblical view of abortion. That's not going to be the case. The choice is not going to be perfect in politics, and here's where I'm getting to. So many times, how many times have you heard a Christian say, well, I can't agree with either candidate, so I'm just not voting. I'm just not voting. Well, by not voting, you're voting. There is no option here. Jefferson made that point very well. It's an informed democracy that we all depend upon. So, now I'm not going to vote because neither candidate thinks exactly like I do. Well, okay. And if you do that, then I think we become culpable for the consequences. So we can't just vote on one issue, but one issue should be one of the things that informs us. So we need to be grounded in biblical principles. We need to be grounded in the principles that made this country what it is, and we need to know what proposed changes are coming, or could come, or have come, that change how we do business in America. If you were around 35 years ago when Bill Clinton was president, Bill Clinton would have been in the Republican Party today. His positions are pretty much where the Republican Party finds itself at this time. The other party, the Democrat Party, would find itself skewed much further to the left than where it was back 35 years ago. My point being, both parties have shifted towards the secular side. One has shifted farther than the other. And that's pretty much non-debatable. So, this current political environment that we find ourselves in leaves a lot of people frustrated. We're to the point, I think it's approaching Vietnam. It may be past Vietnam in the amount of polarization that we now see. And issues are now being circumvented by personalities. I don't like the way that one laughs. I don't like the way this one combs their hair. What in God's name does that have to do with anything on either side? We are characterizing and cartoonizing, if you will, people who one or the other is going to be the leader of the most powerful nation on earth. We need to be beyond that, I would say. So, these are some of the things that we need to think about, because these have emerged as topics, and then we need to ask ourselves, how does this impact, how does this line up against what we know to be Christian and biblical principles? We now have, in some places, where abortion is now legal up to 9 months, and in some places, infanticide for babies who survive botched abortions. And the question is, where is that coming from? How do we deal with it? Jesus said, "Suffer the little children and do not keep them from my presence." When he says suffer, what he's saying is, you better let those guys come in. Don't keep them away from me. Psalm says, children are a heritage from the Lord. Offspring are a reward from him. But they're being treated like commodities because we haven't decided that fertilization is when life begins. And if you ask the person who fundamentally says, yes, it's a human right, they will almost inevitably say, because life hasn't begun, it's not really alive. And so perhaps you'll never hear this from the press, but it's the kind of thing where the press should be making these statements. But nevertheless, the Justice Department has been weaponized that go after states that do not protect, quote, reproductive freedom. Now you're saying, really? I want to read these words to you. These are from the Attorney General of the United States. When the current Supreme Court overturned Roe v. Wade, this was put out by the Department of Justice, by the Attorney General. Today, the Supreme Court overturned Roe v. Wade and Planned Parenthood versus Casey, and held that the right to abortion is no longer protected by the Constitution. The Supreme Court has eliminated an established right that has been an essential component of women's liberty for over half a century, a right that's safeguarded women's ability to participate fully and equally in society. And in renouncing this fundamental right, which it had repeatedly recognized and reaffirmed, the court has suspended the doctrine of stare decisis, which is just a simple way of saying past decisions, a key pillar of the rule of law. The Justice Department strongly disagrees with the court's decision. This decision deals a devastating blow to reproductive freedom in the United States. It will have an immediate and irreversible impact on the lives of people across the country, and it will be greatly disproportionate in its effect, with the greatest burdens felt by people of color and those of limited financial means. Well, if we went by the rule of stare decisis, then we would have never overturned Brown versus Board of Education. We would have never overturned Plessy Ferguson. The whole notion that laws are somehow intractable and should never be revisited is, of course, the reason why we have courts. And if you remember the words of one of the court members, she famously said, "We never should have taken up Roe v. Wade. The decision was not couched in constitutional law." But when you say it will greatly disproportionate in its effect felt by people of color and those of limited financial means, this is kind of ironic as well, because there's something called Planned Parenthood, which opened its first clinic in 1916, which was opened by a lady named Margaret Sanger. Margaret Sanger was a eugenicist. Margaret Sanger believed that there were genes in the gene population that need to be removed. And the best way to remove them, she felt, was through birth control. And if birth control was not the most available, then we'll go to abortion. Sanger's views were so I don't want to say extreme, but Sanger's views were so profound that one of the things that Planned Parenthood finally did was kind of scratch her out of there. She's no longer part of their legacy, if you will. She got erased. But here's an interesting thing. He says the people who be greatly felt by people of color and those of limited financial means. So you want to know where most of your abortion clinics are located? Poor, black communities. We're now at a place where we're putting males in female private spaces. Bathrooms, locker rooms, shelters, prisons, and sports. We now have a radical reduction of free speech and free exercise of religion, including compelled speech that has any criticism of the LGBTQ agenda. You say, no, that can't be. Well, in July of 2023, a federal judge ruled the current administration's efforts to suppress social media posts antithetical to their views. The judge described it as Orwellian. By the way, it was appealed to the Fifth Circuit Court. The Fifth Circuit Court upheld the original ruling. In August of 2024, Mark Zuckerberg, you should know who that is, testified before Congress that Facebook was pressured into suppressing free speech. Something he says he now really regrets. Quote, "I believe the government pressure was wrong and I regret that we were not more outspoken about it." And to that I say horse feathers. Because you can look at the trends that took place and it was very clear that there was some complicit efforts here to make sure if you had a certain view about COVID, it wasn't going to be shared. Because it didn't, quote, follow the science. And so here we go, right? Former presidential candidate just suggested, like yesterday, during an appearance on MSNBC, that we need to control social media, being the government. Meanwhile, the judge has said the attempt to control it was Orwellian, and she's saying, no, we need more. Americans accused, according to this person, of interfering in U.S. elections by spreading propaganda promoting former presidents as perhaps being elected or not, should be civilly or even criminally charged. Now, the interesting thing about that is this person also claims she lost the election, that it was stolen from her. How do you do this? This is what happens when ideologies start to creep in and basic American principles as well as biblical principles start to get squeezed out. I have no problem with someone saying that they think the election was rigged. I should be able to figure this out on my own to see whether that is actually the case. And if I can't, then we're such an ignorant society that government can't save us from ourselves. We're peanuts. I have seen the enemy. It's me. If we can't survive in an information age and we want to depend upon the government to be the arbiter of the information we receive, then guess what? Whoever is in power is going to determine what truth is. This sounds like Jesus and Pilate 2,000 years ago. This is what was said yesterday. If the platforms, whether it be Facebook or Twitter, X or Instagram or TikTok, if they don't moderate and monitor the content, we lose total control. I wonder who the we is. There are now states that will abduct your minor child if you do not support the child's identification to the state's satisfaction. They feel like they have the right to come in and remove your child. We have now legalized, in some states, school officials intentionally lying to parents about what their children identify as. The state feels like it has no obligation to inform the parent of what is going on. If a parent does not support their child's agenda, then there are cases where they have been denied custody in divorce settlements because you don't comply with how someone feels. In certain cases, for educational employment opportunities, if there's an indoctrination that takes place about certain ideologies, if you do not comply, you can be removed. We lost nurses all around the country in COVID because what? They didn't want to take the vaccine. Now think about this for a second. Now, I will go on record as saying I took 2 of them. But here's the point. If the vaccines work, what do I care if you took it? And if you feel like you didn't need to take it, and the vaccines don't work, then it seems to me we're both kind of stewing in the same pot anyway. I don't get it. But yet we told you got to go home. And people lost their livelihoods. Or if you refuse to say a child's particular pronouns that they've told you they're going to say, we'll fire you. And a Virginia school system did that. They fired the gentleman. And the gentleman just got $575,000 from the school system because the school system had violated its constitutional rights. See, they're still there, but we have to remember that. There have been pro-life protesters and whistleblowers at hospitals. The whistleblowers were pointing out that chemical castrations were still going on along with mutilation surgeries, even after the state had passed an order that said that will not take place. And the whistleblower said, well, we're still doing it. That was a doctor in Texas. He was indicted by the DOJ because he had allegedly, the allegation was, he violated HIPAA rules because he exposed the continuation of chemical castration procedures at the children's hospital he was working at. He was indicted. We now have people within government who say that the government should provide sex change for prisoners and this, as well as for undocumented people living in America. Meanwhile, if you're pro-life and you're a whistleblower, you can be indicted for holding that view. I'm going to suggest to you that state-sponsored child abuse and chemical castration, or chemical castration and surgical mutilation is child abuse. It's nothing but. Other countries have figured this out. Sweden stopped. They said, "No, we're not doing that anymore. No. We don't have the data to make it work. All this stuff about the suicide data and stuff is not. It is not linking in. We have no evidence of that. We're not doing it." So they backed off. America, meanwhile, is boldly going where no country will now go. Follow the science. Loss of federal student loans and ultimately loss of accreditation for Christian schools that do not agree to certain agendas. That's how that's how accreditation is now trying to get at private Christian colleges. They're basically trying to say, you can teach whatever you want to. The government certainly allows you to do that. But we just won't accredit you. So when you graduate from this Christian college, you have a diploma that seems to be worth what? Nothing. So I'll still get you. You got the right to, but don't think that we're going to recognize what you work for. Student loans, by the way, the same thing. If you don't want to, we won't give student loans. Well, when I was working in schools, I got a note one time that said that the Department of Justice has now determined that students should be, this whole business about which restroom they go to and what and all that. And if you don't, you're going to be in danger of losing your school, your free and reduced lunch, your federal subsidies for lunch. I didn't have federal subsidies for lunch. I stayed away from federal subsidies for lunch. Ronald Reagan maybe said it right. Some of the worst words that you'll ever hear is, I'm from the government and I'm here to help. Illegal immigration proliferation. This isn't about immigration. Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses. America's always been a place where immigrants are welcome and indeed with open arms. But when you open your border and you just allow indiscriminate entry into your country, one of the first things we've seen is fentanyl. One of the second things we've seen is sex trafficking. And one of the third things we've seen is rampant crime. Everywhere. You're not just letting in immigrants. You're letting in anything. By the way, most of the people that are in Congress that espouse this kind of stuff try to go knock on their door. See how that works. You're not going to get there. And the second thing is, for anybody that says, well, Jesus was apolitical, Jerusalem had a wall. And it had a wall for a good reason, because it protected the citizens that it was designed to protect. We now, if you watched it, probably with some degree of incredulity, we now have justices who no longer feel like they're qualified to say, who's a woman? I don't believe I can give that answer. I'm not qualified. I'm not a professional. You're sitting on the Supreme Court. You're about to rule on matters where you're going to be an expert, whether you're an expert or not. And if you can't answer this most basic question, it becomes kind of concerning. So these are the kind of things where if somebody says, I am immoral and unethical, I'm asking, what are these? Because at the end of the day, I'm not voting for a haircut. I'm probably not even voting for someone that I would like to have dinner with. And this is just my personal choice, because if somebody disagrees with me, this is still land of the free and home of the brave. Your vote counts just as much for whatever reason. I'm saying as Christians, what we need to begin to examine is, what are the policies that are at play here? What are we going to do with them? How are we going to deal with them? And here's the point. You want to know one of the largest blocks that didn't vote in the last election? Evangelicals. They stayed home. Because we didn't get everything we wanted in exactly the way we don't, well, then I'll just pop my ball and go home. Well, not voting is voting. And we now find ourselves in a situation where we're going to have to ask whether some of the things that have driven and guided this country and that are based upon biblical principles, whether they're going to be kind of cast aside because we're past all that. So this is a conversation not to the person who might disagree with me. It's to the people who need to examine whether or not these principles bump into who we are as Christians and what it is that we are supposed to represent. If you don't agree with me, I will tell you, anyone that's listening to this has already turned it off. And that's okay. And they are they're perfectly within their rights to say that I'm unethical, immoral. They can even think I'm stupid. I'll grant them that. That's their right. But it's also our obligation to take some of these things and start to think. And none of these are made up. All of these are realities right now occurring. And they're occurring 30 days before an election. So the only thing standing between a government that shifts even further left, and instead of left, let me just say it this way, that shifts further secular, that goes completely to the point where biblical-based principles are really no longer of any consequence or whatever. Then part of what happens is how do we as Christians respond to the need to step up and make sure that we at least do what we can. So I'm going to tell you what I'm going to do on November, whatever day it is. I'm going to be one of the old fuddy-duddies, and I'm going to actually go in there and pull a lever. Now, I'm going to pull a lever for a candidate that I believe provides the best opportunity to not have America continue to slide towards some of the things that we're seeing America today. And then I'm going to leave it in God's hands, because that's as far as I can take it. But I think we have to get to the point where we quit calling each other stupid and immoral just because you don't like the guy or gal that might be on the other side of the fence. It's far more complicated than that. But if you haven't thought about these things, and I'm sure you have, but particularly this one about abortion, which has become apparently one of the bell cow issues in federal elections now. As a Christian, you need to be aware not just what the Bible says, but what biology says. And if you go pick up any standard freshman level biology text and you start looking at sexual reproduction, guess what it's going to tell you about fertilization? That's where life begins. So, to reiterate one last time, this is not about standing out there on the street corner and telling everybody else they're going to hell because they disagree with what I think. In fact, they're perfectly within their rights to disagree with what I think. It is about us as Christians examining the issues that are collectively gathering themselves together for this election, and then deciding how do we vote on election, how do we vote on issues, what are we guided by, what are our principles, and then making sure that we exercise the right given to us as Americans to express our options. I would leave that with one other thing. 2016, you know what the voter turnout was? 53%. A democracy is not a democracy if it becomes a minority of people voting in elections. We weren't far from it. Imagine if 47% of the people voted and 53% didn't. We are now a democracy ruled by a minority. We have to vote. We have to vote. It's our obligation. So, as Christians, I would say. And if you ask John, he'd say, yeah. And if you ask Nathan, he'd say, yeah. And if you ask Moses, he'd say, yeah. And if you ask Jesus, I think he'd say, yeah. Because the issues that you're dealing with here are impacting my children, my kids. The ones I said, suffer not. Let them come to me. Well, I'm not sure they can under some of these conditions. So yeah, I kind of think he'd expect us to vote. But you're going to have to vote your own conscience. But that was my conscience, so I felt like I had to share it.
Thank you.
Father, we thank you for today. We ask for your blessing. We repent to the extent that we can for the ills of our country, for the injustices done to our poor, to our needy, to the neglect that we sometimes allow to take place, for the indifference that we have for our fellow man. for our willingness to stand behind laws and policies instead of getting our hands dirty and working, instead of helping the person deliberating over to birth or not birth their child, to stand with them instead of screaming at them. For all the things that we do that are decidedly non-Christian, we repent. But may we also recognize our obligation to carry your principles into the world and indeed into government, because government has been instituted by you as a necessary and appropriate control for our lives. May we not let that become something we ignore, or let it become something that takes our constitutional liberties and places them